He had spent 9 years, and what felt like every dollar he didn't need for groceries trying to hear that piano play again. 9 years, 14 tuners, 3 restorers flown in from the East Coast, and every single one of them had walked away shaking their heads at the same 1923 Steinway Model D sitting in the back room of a house that belonged to a woman who hadn't smiled in nearly a decade. Margaret Hollis was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had built Hollis Capital from a spare bedroom and a second-hand laptop into a firm managing north of $2 billion. She had outlasted 3 market crashes, 2 hostile takeovers, and 1 federal audit that her competitors had quietly hoped would finish her. She was 58 years old, and she had the bearing of someone who had decided very early that the world responded better to composure than to need. But the piano. The piano was the one thing she could not fix, could not replace, could not route around with competence and capital. It had belonged to her mother, Frances, who had died 11 years ago in the same chair, where she used to sit and play hymns on Sunday mornings. Frances Hollis had not been a professional musician. She had been a school teacher in Beaumont, Texas, who played by ear and never learned to read sheet music properly, and did not care, because the piano was not about precision. It was about the particular, irreplaceable sound of her hands on those keys, warm and slightly uneven and entirely hers. Margaret had the piano shipped to her home in Connecticut the week after the funeral. It was a practical decision, she told herself. The instrument was valuable. It needed a climate-controlled space. It needed to be somewhere it would be cared for. She did not let herself say the other thing, the thing that was actually true. She brought it because she was not ready to let it go. The problem started 8 months later. A tuner came in for the first time since the move and discovered something wrong in the action mechanism, the internal system of hammers and levers that translated a key press into sound. Several notes produced a tone that was thin and hollow, like something essential had gone out of them. A few didn't sound at all. The tuner said it was likely damage from the move, stress on the internal components from temperature changes during transport. He said it was fixable. He said it would take time. That was the last accurate thing anyone said about it for 9 years. The restorers came one after another. Some were genuinely talented. A woman named Patricia, out of Boston, had 40 years of experience with concert instruments and spent 6 days examining the action before telling Margaret, with the particular regret of a professional who respects a problem that has defeated her, that the damage was unlike anything she'd encountered. Not in type, the mechanism was recognizable, but in the specific way it had failed. The wood had reacted to something during the move, or possibly before, in a way that created a cascading instability across the entire action. Fix one note, and 2 others shifted. The instrument was compensating for itself in a way that made standard restoration protocols actively counterproductive. Patricia charged half her usual rate and said she was sorry. After Patricia, Margaret stopped counting. She paid what was asked, read the reports she received, and filed them in a folder that grew heavy over the years. By year 7, she had stopped going into the back room entirely. Her housekeeper, a quiet woman named Bet, who had been managing the household for 12 years, had learned not to mention the piano. Not because Margaret had said anything, but because of the way her expression changed when the subject came near, a subtle, involuntary compression, as though she were bracing for something. The piano sat in its room with the curtains drawn, beautiful and silent. On the afternoon that changed everything, Margaret was coming back from a site visit to the property next door, which she had recently acquired for a renovation project, and which had turned out to have drainage problems that would require significant regrading. She was walking the long way around the property boundary, which took her past the old workshop building at the rear of the grounds. A structure she rarely used, which had been converted years ago from some kind of agricultural outbuilding into a space for general storage and overflow maintenance. A truck was parked beside it. Not one of her contractor's vehicles. A dark blue pickup, older. One of the rear quarter panels slightly dented, with a small child's sneaker visible through the back window, propped against the glass as if its owner had kicked it off and left it there. She slowed. Inside the workshop, someone was working. She could hear it, the particular rhythm of a person in the middle of something careful. A low, intermittent sound, the sound of a tool being set down gently on a hard surface. She pushed the door open. A man was crouched beside one of the old workbenches, examining a section of the estate's irrigation control panel that had been removed for repair. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, in a dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had dark hair with some gray at the temples and the kind of hands that suggested years of actual physical work. The knuckles slightly enlarged, the grip automatic and confident. He was looking at the control panel the way you look at something when you're not looking for a specific answer, but trying to understand the whole of it. He looked up when she came in. His name was Corbin Hadley. He had been doing maintenance work on several properties in the area for the past 2 years, and her estate manager had hired him 3 months ago without, apparently, feeling the need to inform Margaret in any detail. She learned this afterward. In the moment, what she knew was that he was calm in a way that was not performed. He didn't stand up quickly or apologize for being there. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, attentive, a little careful, the look of someone who is good at reading rooms. He said, "Mrs. Hollis, I was getting to the irrigation panel today. There's a fault in the secondary control circuit that's been causing the east sector to underwater." Margaret looked at the panel, then at him. "How long have you been on the property?" "About 3 months. I come Tuesdays and Thursdays. Sometimes Saturdays if there's a project running." She didn't remember seeing him. She made a mental note to discuss with her estate manager the process by which contractors were vetted and hired, and then said, "Fine," and started to leave, and then stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. She had been stopping mid-stride a great deal lately, she had noticed, hesitating at the edges of decisions, second-guessing the forward momentum that had always felt automatic. Grief does something to the machinery of certainty. She had been told this. She had not believed it would happen to her. She turned back. "I have something," she said, "inside the house. A piano. A 1923 Steinway that hasn't functioned properly in 9 years. 14 people have looked at it. None of them could fix it." Corbin was quiet for a moment. He had returned his attention to the irrigation panel, but she could tell he was listening. "I'm not a piano technician," he said. "I know that." Another pause. He set the tool he was holding down on the workbench. "What have they told you about it?" "That the action is unstable. That fixing one component destabilizes others. That it's an unusual failure pattern." She paused. "One of them called it a cascading interaction. The instruments could detect the effects of the problem, but not the origin." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, a small change, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching carefully. His eyes moved slightly, the internal motion of a person rearranging what they thought they knew. "What year did it ship?" he asked. Not solicitously, not performing curiosity, just asking. 11 years ago, from Beaumont, Texas, in February." He nodded slowly, looked at the panel again, then at nothing particular, then at her. "I can take a look at it," he said. "I'm not promising anything, but I can look." Margaret had said this moment felt, later, like the first moment in 9 years that something in her chest had moved. Not open, not yet, but moved, the way ice shifts before it breaks. She said, "All right." She showed him to the back room that afternoon and left him there. She did not stay to watch. She had watched too many people look at the piano with confident expressions that slowly changed into careful ones. She couldn't do it again. She sat in her study for 2 hours pretending to read a financial report and listening, without meaning to, for sounds from the back of the house. There were sounds, not music, working sounds. The kind she now recognized as the sounds of a person who was not performing competence, but simply working. The low creak of the piano bench. A single key struck, then another, then silence. 20 minutes of silence, then keys again, a run of notes she didn't recognize, something halting and incomplete. At 7 o'clock, Bet appeared in the doorway of the study. "He's still in there," she said. "He brought his daughter. She's been sitting in the hallway for the past hour doing homework on the floor." Margaret set her report down. "How old?" 9, maybe 10. She's got those big headphones on. The foam kind, yellow. She's been there the whole time." Margaret walked to the back hallway. A girl was sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the piano room with a spiral notebook in her lap, a pencil in her hand, and a pair of oversized yellow headphones on her head, the kind you'd use on a construction site. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly come undone, and she was writing something with the focused, slightly exaggerated concentration of a child who is working very hard and knows it. She looked up when she heard footsteps. "Hi," the girl said. She pulled one side of the headphones off her ear. Sorry. I know I'm in the way. I can move. You're not in the way. What are the headphones for? The girl looked slightly embarrassed in the way children look when something they've done makes perfect sense to them, but they anticipate it requiring explanation. So I can think, she said. There's nothing actually playing. They just make it quieter. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Do they work? Pretty well. The girl tilted her head. Better than regular quiet, which is weird. What's your name? Hazel. I'm Ms. Hollis. This is my house. I know, Hazel said. Dad said to stay in the hallway and not touch anything. I haven't touched anything. A pause. Except the floor. But that's just because I'm sitting on it. Inside the piano room, a key was struck. Then two together. Then a pause of several seconds. Hazel put her headphone back over her ear. He gets like this, she said, in the tone of someone reporting a familiar phenomenon. When he finds something to think about, he just goes away for a while. Margaret stood in the hallway for another moment, feeling obscurely as though she had walked into a scene that had been running without her. Then she went back to her study. He left at 9 o'clock, Hazel walking beside him with her headphones around her neck and her notebook under her arm. Margaret heard the front door close and watched from the window as they crossed to the truck. Hazel was saying something to him, gesturing with the hand that held the notebook, and he bent his head slightly to hear her and said something back, and she made a face that was not disagreement but the specific skepticism of a child who is not yet convinced but is considering it. The truck pulled out slowly. Margaret stood at the window for a moment. Then she went to the back room. The piano room smelled faintly different. She couldn't have said precisely how. Nothing had been moved that she could see, but something had been opened. The front panel that concealed the upper action was propped carefully against the wall, and she could see the interior of the instrument, the rows of hammers and strings, the intricate machinery that had been sitting in the same broken state for 9 years. She hadn't looked at the inside of it in years. She looked now. She did not know what she was looking for and did not find it, but she stayed for a while. Corbin came back the next morning. He arrived at 7, which Bet reported from the kitchen window where she was making coffee and watching the drive with what Margaret recognized as the benevolent curiosity of a woman who had been waiting for years for something interesting to happen on this property. He brought Hazel again. Hazel was in her school uniform, a navy jumper over a white shirt, and she had her backpack on and her headphones hanging around her neck. She looked, Margaret thought, like a person prepared for both eventualities, whatever her father was doing and whatever school required. Margaret met him at the back hallway. You could have come to the front door, she said. I know. But this was faster. He had a canvas bag with him, different from what he'd brought yesterday, heavier, with the specific weight of things that had been carefully selected. I need to ask you some things before I go back in. All right, the February move. What was the weather like? Cold. There was ice. They had to wait a day at the origin point before they could load it, so the instrument sat in a warehouse for a day in cold weather before it was heated for transport. She hadn't known to remember this, but she did. There was some kind of delay at the storage facility, yes. It was in a heated unit, but the heating had been inconsistent that week. The facility apologized. Corbin was quiet for a moment, processing this. And before the move, how long had the piano been in your mother's house? Since she bought it. 60 years, approximately. Same room that whole time? Same corner of the same room. She never moved it. She said it had found where it wanted to be. Something in that sentence seemed to settle for him, the way a piece placed accurately settles in a puzzle. He nodded once, not at her, to himself. Okay, he said. What are you thinking? He looked at her directly, and she had the sense of a person choosing their words with the care of someone who doesn't like imprecision. I'm thinking there's a pattern to the failure that nobody has identified yet, because they were all looking at the action itself. But the action is displaying symptoms, not causing them. He paused. I want to check the soundboard before I say anything else, because if I'm wrong about where I think this is, I'll have wasted your time again. Margaret held his gaze. It was the most specific thing anyone had said to her about this instrument in years. Not reassurance, not performance, just a person telling her what they were actually thinking and why they weren't telling her more yet. All right, she said. How long? Today I'll know if I'm right. If I'm right, maybe another day after that. She left him to it. Hazel stationed herself in the hallway again, headphones on, cross-legged, with a different notebook from yesterday. Margaret watched her twice. The second time, Hazel pulled one headphone off. "Is it okay if I get a glass of water?" she asked. "I was going to ask earlier, but then I forgot. Bet can get you whatever you need." "The kitchen is. I know where it is," Hazel said. "I scouted it yesterday." Then, apparently recognizing how this sounded, "Not to take anything, just to know where it was. That's sensible." Hazel tilted her head. "Dad says I overplan. Do you think you do?" "I think he underplans," Hazel said, with the certainty of someone who has considered both positions and reached a firm conclusion. "It evens out." From inside the piano room, a scale was played. Then another. Then something slower, a melody searching for itself. Hazel and Margaret were both quiet for a moment, listening. "He does that," Hazel said softly. "Not explaining it, just marking it. The observation of a child who has learned to be near concentration without interrupting it." Margaret went back to her office. She sat at her desk with her hands in her lap and did not open her email for a full 15 minutes, which was not something she ever did. Corbin found the problem on the afternoon of the second day. He came to her office at 4 o'clock, which was not something any previous technician had ever done. They had always sent written reports or made phone calls in which they explained, at length, what they had not found. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "Can I show you something?" he asked. He took her to the piano room and lifted the bottom front panel, which she had not previously seen opened, and pointed to a section of the soundboard near the bass end of the instrument. The soundboard is the large resonant surface, the voice of the piano, and in a healthy instrument it is curved slightly, under tension, the way a drum membrane is held taut. In Francis's piano, a section of the soundboard had developed a very specific, very slight deviation in its curve over 6 decades of life in the same corner of the same room, not damage in the conventional sense. The board was intact, but the tension was uneven in a way that was almost immeasurable. A fraction of a millimeter. And that fraction had been amplified by the cold exposure during the move, which had caused the wood to contract in a pattern that reinforced the existing deviation rather than correcting it. The result was that the soundboard was vibrating slightly out of phase with itself. And because the soundboard is what the hammers ultimately speak through, the action above it was compensating, overcorrecting, years after year, hammer by hammer, until the entire system was in a state of sustained internal tension that no one had identified because they had been looking at the action, and the action was a symptom, not the cause. Margaret stood and looked at what he was showing her for a long moment. "How did you find this?" she asked. "I listened to it." He straightened up. "I don't mean that as a mystical answer. I mean I played it, or tried to play it, for a long time, and I listened to what it was doing wrong, not just to the wrong notes, but to the quality of the wrongness. The notes that failed weren't failing randomly. There was a pattern to which ones and when. That kind of pattern means the cause is in a fixed location doing a consistent thing." He paused. "Once I understood the pattern, the soundboard was the only place it could be coming from. Everything else had been ruled out. 14 technicians, Margaret said, slowly. 9 years. They were all working from each other's reports by the end. When the 4th or 5th restorer comes through, they're looking in the places the previous ones looked, trying to find what was missed. Nobody started fresh." He looked at the piano. Also, the soundboard deviation was 60 years in the making. It wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't visible. The instruments everyone brought were designed to find breaks and failures, not gradual drift. You can't find gradual drift with a tool built for detecting acute damage. Margaret stood beside the instrument that had lived in her mother's house for 60 years, and then come to her in the way things come when the person who loved them most no longer can, and she put both hands flat on the closed fallboard and breathed through her nose once. She did not cry. She had not cried in this room in 9 years because she had been too busy being angry. At the situation, at the technicians, at herself for failing to fix the one thing she had promised herself she would fix. The anger had been, she understood now, a more comfortable posture than the grief underneath it. She breathed again. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Her voice was level. "Yes," he said. "The repair is not complicated once you've located the cause. I need to make a controlled adjustment to the soundboard tension, which will take time to do correctly, and then recalibrate the action response from scratch. But the instrument is fundamentally sound." He paused. "It's been waiting in a broken state for 9 years. The essential thing is still there. She nodded once. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3. She stepped back from the piano. She looked at it for another moment. The dark walnut cabinet, the slightly raised lid, the 88 keys that had not made the sound they were supposed to make, since before her mother's chair was empty. Thank you, she said. She said it quietly, and it came out with more of the actual thing underneath it than she had intended. Corbin looked at her, and he did not say you're welcome, and he did not say it's nothing, and he did not perform the particular discomfort that people usually performed when they encountered raw feeling in a professional context. He simply let her have it. Stood there in his dark flannel shirt with the rolled sleeves and let the moment be what it was. I'll come back Friday, he said. He collected his tools. Margaret heard the front door. She heard the truck. She heard Hazel's voice asking something and Corbin's lower answer, and then the sound of the engine moving away down the drive. She did not go back to her office. She sat down on the piano bench and put her hands in her lap, and she sat there in the near dark with the curtain still drawn, and she thought about her mother. Not the grief version of Frances Hollis, not the absence version, but the actual Frances. The woman who played by ear and didn't care about technical precision. Who sat in this piano's presence for 60 years and played hymns on Sunday mornings and never once thought about soundboard tension or action calibration, because those were not the point. The music was the point. The being there was the point. She thought about that for a long time. The following Friday, when Corbin came back with his tools and Hazel came back with a different book and her yellow headphones and posted herself in the hallway again, Margaret brought coffee out without asking. She set a mug on the floor next to Hazel's book. Thank you, Hazel said, examining it. I don't usually drink coffee, but I'll try it. It has a lot of milk in it. That makes it more of a coffee-flavored milk. Hazel tried it. That's actually fine. Margaret sat on the bench along the wall across from the girl and opened her own coffee. From inside the piano room, Corbin was working, quiet, methodical, the sounds of careful adjustment rather than construction. It was a different quality of sound than the previous visits, more deliberate. Does he do this often? Margaret asked. Bring you to work with him. He does it when there's no school, Hazel said, and sometimes when there is school and he has to go somewhere after pickup. She turned a page. I don't mind it. I get a lot of reading done. Does he always work on unusual things? Hazel thought about this. He works on whatever people need, but the unusual ones are the ones he actually thinks about. I can tell the difference because of the quiet. She seemed to consider whether to explain further. When it's a normal job, he's just regular quiet. When it's something interesting, he gets deeper quiet, like a different kind. How long has it been just the two of you? Hazel held the mug with both hands. Since I was born. My mom died when I was born. Well, a couple weeks after. She said it the way children say things they have learned to say, not without weight, but without the performance of weight. She had been carrying this fact her whole life and had arrived at a relationship with it that was honest and clear. Dad doesn't talk about her all the time, but he talks about her sometimes. I asked him once if he was still sad, and he said yes, but he said sad, and okay could be true at the same time, and I should remember that. Margaret looked at her coffee. That's good advice, she said. He gives pretty good advice, Hazel said. He's not always right about everything, but he's usually right about the important stuff. She returned to her book and then looked up again. He said you've been trying to fix the piano for 9 years. Is that true? Yes. Hazel nodded slowly. That's a lot of trying. It is. Was it your mom's? Margaret looked at her. The directness of children, she thought, was either intolerable or clarifying depending on the day. Yes, she said. She died 11 years ago. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so you didn't just want the piano fixed. You wanted something else that the piano had. Margaret did not answer immediately because the sentence had arrived somewhere real and required a moment. Yes, she said. I think that's right. Dad says that happens with things, Hazel said. That something can be about itself and about something else at the same time. And the tricky part is knowing which problem you're actually trying to solve. She looked at Margaret with the unguarded directness of someone who hasn't yet learned that accuracy can be uncomfortable. It sounds like you've maybe been solving the wrong one. In the piano room, something shifted, a low sound of something settling. Then a single note, struck once, clear and round in the air. Both of them went still, another note, Then another. Then a phrase, tentative, feeling its way forward, the sound of an instrument coming back from a long distance. Margaret's hands went tight around the coffee mug. The phrase stopped. Silence. Then Corbin's voice from inside the room, even matter of fact. That's the adjustment holding. I need another hour to complete the calibration. Hazel looked at Margaret. Her expression was careful. The careful look of a child who has learned to be near adult emotion without reacting to it too quickly. It sounds different, Hazel said. Even just that. It sounded like a real piano. Margaret set her mug on the floor and leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. The sound of that single phrase had done something to the air in the hallway. She couldn't have explained it. It had the specific quality of something returning from a long way away. Not exactly the sound she remembered from her mother's house, but close enough to carry the memory forward. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Hazel said nothing, which was the right thing. She went back to her book and turned a page and did not look up, and in this way gave Margaret the thing she needed, which was proximity without observation. After a while, Margaret said, "Your father said you have strong opinions about headphones." Hazel's mouth curved. "Dad says I have strong opinions about everything. Is he wrong?" "No," Hazel admitted, "but some of them are correct opinions. That's the best kind." When Corbin came out of the piano room 2 hours later, he came into the hallway and said simply, "It's done." He was wiping his hands on a shop rag. His expression was the expression she recognized from the previous visits. Not triumphant. Something quieter and more settled. The look of a person who has done a thing correctly. "Do you want to play it?" he asked. She stood up from the bench. Her legs were slightly unsteady, which was not something she would have predicted, and she put one hand against the wall for a moment. Then she walked into the piano room. The instrument looked the same. Of course it did. The walnut cabinet, the slightly raised lid, the keys. But when she sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, she could feel something different. A quality in the resistance, the way the keys responded to the weight of her fingers. Alive in a way she had forgotten. She was not a pianist. She had never been. Frances had tried to teach her as a child, and she had learned basics without feeling them. Music was her mother's language, not hers, but she knew the hymn. She knew it because she had heard it every Sunday morning for 20 years, played by hands that knew it without thinking. It was a simple thing, 4 lines, slow, built from a few notes. She had not thought about playing it in 11 years. She had not let herself think about it. Her right hand found the first note. It rang in the room clear and round and full in a way that made her catch her breath. The second note, the third, the phrase, it was not perfect. Her left hand came in wrong twice. She played too slowly in some places and stopped in the middle of a line to collect herself. But the sound, the piano's actual voice, the voice it had had for 60 years in Frances's house, that was right. The warmth of it, the slight imperfection that was its character. She played to the end of the first verse and stopped. Hazel was in the doorway. She had come in so quietly that Margaret hadn't heard her. She was standing with her headphones around her neck and her book closed in her hands, and she was just listening. Corbin was by the window. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hazel said softly, "That was pretty." Margaret turned on the bench to face them. She did not try to compose her expression, which was not composed, which was not professional or controlled or any of the things she had spent most of her adult life making sure her face communicated. It was just what it was. "It sounds like hers," she said. "It sounds like the way it sounded." Corbin looked at her from by the window. "It should," he said. "The instrument is what it always was. It just needed someone to listen to what it was saying." She stayed in the piano room for a long time after they left. She heard the front door, heard the truck, heard Hazel's voice carrying across the cold November air with some observation that arrived at distance as tone without content. The sound of a child talking to her father, ordinary and specific and entirely their own. The piano room was quiet. She put her hands back on the keys and played the hymn again. Slower this time, with less of the functional hurry she applied to most things. She let the notes be what they were. Not a performance, not even a memory exactly, but a conversation with something she had been unable to reach for a very long time. Her mother had not been a technically accomplished musician. She had played by feel, by ear, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had never worried about whether she was doing it right. That ease had always slightly baffled Margaret. who applied technical rigor to most things and found instinct suspicious. She had spent a lot of her life being slightly baffled by the way her mother moved through the world. She understood it better now. She played until her hands were tired, which took longer than she expected. The word got out the way things get out, not all at once but in accumulation. Bet mentioned it to her sister. The estate manager mentioned it to someone else. By the end of the following week, 2 people had called Margaret asking if it was true that some maintenance worker had fixed the piano that the restorers from Boston and New York hadn't been able to touch. Margaret said yes, that was true. They asked who he was. She said he was someone who listened to the problem differently than everyone else had. She did not embellish. She was not a woman who embellished. But she found in telling it that the plain version of the story had a quality she hadn't expected. It did something to people. Not because it was unusual, though it was, but because of something in the structure of it. The long trying, the failure, the unexpected arrival, the thing returned. It had the shape of something people recognized, even if they couldn't name what. She called Corbin on a Tuesday morning in December. He answered on the 3rd ring in the slightly compressed way of someone who has one hand occupied with something. "I've been thinking about our situation," she said. It was not the most precise opening she'd ever used, and she knew it, and she said it anyway because she was trying something new, which was starting from an honest place rather than a positioned one. "Which situation?" he said. "You," she said, "and what you actually are as opposed to what I hired you to do." A pause. Outside her window, the first of the December snow was considering whether to commit. He said, "I'm not sure those are different things." "They are," she said, "considerably." She had done her research by then. She had found, through a contact in the manufacturing sector, the name of a company where Corbin Hadley had worked for 12 years as a precision systems engineer, before his wife died and he left the industry entirely and moved with his newborn daughter to a small town in Connecticut and started doing maintenance work for a reason that no one had ever asked him about. "You worked at Aldwell Precision for over a decade. You have 2 patents on acoustic resonance calibration systems. One of them is currently licensed to 3 major instrument manufacturers." Silence. "The Steinway," she said. "You weren't guessing. You have more specific knowledge of how those instruments fail than almost anyone currently working in restoration." "I had it," he said. "Past tense. I've been out of it for 9 years. The field has moved. The physics of wooden instruments has not moved." A longer pause. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "I want to talk about it in person," she said. "Not a formal meeting. Just a conversation. Bring Hazel if she's not in school." She paused. Bet found out her favorite is the lemon squares. A brief quiet that had a different quality than the others. "Hazel talks too much," he said, but it was without heat. "She talks accurately," Margaret said. "There's a difference." He came on a Thursday. Hazel was in school. It was a school day, and Mrs. Ellison, who was apparently the most committed second-grade teacher in the county's history on the subject of times tables, was not a woman whose schedule bowed to lemon squares. Corbin came alone, which made the conversation feel both easier and more difficult in ways that Margaret noted and did not examine too closely. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours. She did not tell him what to want. She had made that mistake with other people she had employed, leading with the conclusion and asking people to arrive at it after her, which was efficient but not honest. Instead, she told him what she saw, which was a person of considerable technical depth who had made a choice that most people would have found inexplicable, and that the more she thought about it, found clarifying. He had chosen presence over position. He had chosen Hazel over the career. Not because he couldn't have both, or not exactly. She believed he could have tried, but because what he needed, in the year after his wife died, was not trying. He needed something that let him be entirely where he was, with the person who needed him entirely, without having to be 2 things at once. She understood this. She had done something different with the same grief. She had expanded, gone faster, filled the space with work and acquisition and forward motion, and she was not sure, sitting across from him now, that her version had served her better. "I'm not asking you to come back to what you were," she said. "The firm I run doesn't need a precision systems engineer in any formal sense. But I have a foundation that does preservation work, instruments, primarily, but architectural elements as well. Things that require the kind of attention That doesn't exist in a commercial restoration model. People who assess what something needs rather than what the standard protocol says to do. She paused. I think you're built for that. Not because of the patents, because of how you found what was wrong with the piano. Corbin turned his coffee mug on the table, the slow rotation of a person turning something over. Hazel would need the same schedule you have now, she said. I had it put in a draft agreement. Morning drop-off, afternoon pickup, full flexibility for school events. In writing, with actual enforceability. She met his eyes. I'm not offering it as a courtesy. I'm offering it because it needs to be real or it isn't worth offering. He was quiet for a long time. Margaret waited. She had become, in the weeks since the piano was repaired, marginally more comfortable with quiet than she had been before. It was not a natural state for her, but she was practicing it. Why this? He asked finally. You could hire anyone for foundation work. I could hire someone with credentials, she said. That's not the same thing. She looked at her own hands on the table. You solved something that 14 people with credentials didn't solve because you didn't start from what you expected to find. You started from what was actually there. She paused. I've spent my career doing the opposite of that. I've gotten very good at knowing what I expect to find before I look. I think I've missed things. She looked at him. I think you'd be harder to miss things with. Something in his expression shifted. The careful quality he always had, the economy of movement, but underneath it, something that had come unstated into the room. I'd need time, he said, to think about it, and to talk to Hazel. Of course, she'll have opinions. I'd expect nothing less. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, the suggestion of one, inhabited and then set down. She keeps asking about the piano, he said. She wanted to know if it made music the right way now. I said yes, she said. He paused. She said it was good when things got to be what they were supposed to be. Margaret looked at her coffee. She's right about that. She's right about a lot of things, Corbin said. It's a genuine inconvenience. Hazel's opinion, delivered to her father that evening after he'd explained the offer over dinner, was reportedly 3 questions in order. Would she still get lemon squares on Thursdays? Would the new schedule mean anything changed about their Friday afternoons, which were apparently their standing afternoon and non-negotiable? And did he actually want to do it, or was he doing it because he thought it was the right thing to do? He called Margaret the following Monday. The answer to Hazel's 3rd question, he told her, was both. Both were true. He had wanted to go back to real work for years, in the quiet, private way of wanting things you have set aside for reasons that were right and still are right, and yet leave a particular absence. And he believed it was the right thing. Those 2 things could be true at the same time. He had learned that a long time ago. Hazel approved? Margaret asked. She approved, he said. She said she wanted to see the piano again when she came Thursday. She can come whenever she wants. A pause. You mean that? I mean most things I say, Margaret said. It's a policy I've had for a while. It turns out to be efficient. He sent back the signed agreement on a Wednesday. Margaret was in a late meeting when the email arrived and didn't see it until she was back at her desk at 9 in the evening. She opened it, read through it once, and sat with it for a moment. Then she got up and walked to the back hallway and stood outside the piano room door. The door was closed. The room was dark. She could see a thin line of light from the window, where the curtain didn't quite meet the wall. She opened the door. The piano sat in the center of the room. The curtains were still drawn. She hadn't changed that habit yet, but the room didn't have the particular quality of dread that had lived in it for years. The piano was present in a different way than it had been, present as itself rather than as the monument to something that couldn't be fixed. She sat down on the bench. She played the hymn again, not perfectly. She was not going to be a musician, but she played it the way Frances had played most things, by feel, by ear, without worrying too much about whether she was doing it right. It was slower than correct tempo. She stopped once and started again. But the piano answered every key with the voice it had been made with, warm and round and full, the voice of 60 years in one corner of one room in one woman's house. She played to the end. Outside, the Connecticut winter was doing what Connecticut winters do, patient and gray, entirely indifferent to what was happening inside any house. The snow had arrived in earnest the week before and was not going anywhere. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap and thought about Frances. Not the grief of her, just Frances. The woman who trusted by ear, who played without reading music, who said the piano had found where it wanted to be. The woman who had raised a daughter, who applied precision and rigor and forward motion to everything, and had built something significant with those tools, and had also, in the gaps between the forward motion, let some things go quiet for too long. She thought about Hazel in the hallway with her noise-blocking headphones, saying that sadness and okayness could be true at the same time. She thought about Corbin in the truck that first day, and what had made her stop and turn back and say the things she'd said. She had been asked this by a journalist who had heard the story third or fourth hand, and called to ask if she would comment. She had declined to comment and then said, almost despite herself, "I turned back because I was tired of going forward." She had not intended to say it. It was the most honest thing she'd said in years. The piano room was warm. She was not ready to open the curtains yet. That would come. She knew it would come. The way she now knew that readiness for the things that matter rarely arrives on schedule, that it accumulates without announcement, and one day you realize it is simply there. She would open them. She would eventually let the light in. She was getting there. But for now the room was warm, and the piano was playing. And something that had been silent for 9 years was finding its voice again. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the thing she had been moving toward without knowing how to move toward it. The thing on the other side of every failed repair and every filed report and every morning, she had rerouted her walk to avoid a room she had been afraid to enter. She played the hymn one more time. It sounded like her mother. It sounded, Margaret thought, exactly like her mother.